It looks like rain.
She was pretending to be somebody else. You don't even have a fairy godmother here. I mean, what more can you say?
Leonardo DaVinci is the freaking fairy godmother in this movie.
Am I to understand that you find me arrogant?
You have everything, and still the world holds no joy. And yet you insist on making fun of those who would see it for its possibilities.
How do you do it?
What?
Live each day with this kind of passion. Don't you find it exhausting?
Only when I'm around you.
Welcome to Sweetheart Saturdays, a rom-commentary podcast hosted by Mika and Becca, two heartwarmed romantics who gush about our favorite romance flicks and examine what makes rom-coms work. Ever After is the quintessential Cinderella story, as evidenced by its roots in historical authenticity, dynamic characterization, and whimsical writing. Plus, the cast is all around fantastic. So today we're going to talk about Ever After, which is a Cinderella story starring Drew Barrymore. But it is very unique, I think, compared to other Cinderella stories. It's set in, the 1500s in France, right?
Sure. Definitely in France. No idea about the time period. 1500s sounds right to me.
16th century.
So
century,
1500s.
But the flash forward that we get a la Titanic is the 19th century. So I was right. 1500s.
Yeah.
In France. And it's got a little bit, I wouldn't say that it is historically accurate, but I would say that it's pretty authentic in its portrayal of the time period and that you feel like you're watching a period film.
Yeah.
Which is really nice. And I feel like we don't see that for Cinderella in authentic ways. Usually when you see Cinderella in a period form, it's more fantasy. You feel like you're stepping into a fairy tale. This Cinderella doesn't feel like that as much, which is really, really fresh. We love this movie. It is a classic. It is something we watch multiple times a year. It just feels really good. Yeah. And I think one of my favorite things in particular about this Cinderella story is that it explores the compassion that she has for other people in a very deep way. There's a lot of depth to it. So she explicitly speaks out against the political oppression, against what the royal family and the government is doing to the people in France at this period of time. Her relationship with being a servant or with other servants, and I guess you could even say trafficking, is a key point of the film. So it's very much deeper than what I think you would get with most Cinderella stories. Like that touch on her abuse and stuff, but don't go too deep into it. Disney's Cinderella, the 2015 version, is the only other one that I can think of that really speaks out in that way, but it's kind of different, I feel like. I love Cinderella and I love the versions of her that we get. I think for Ever After, it was fun for me to watch, but I didn't understand all the depth to what she's fighting or what she's going through, and so I really love Danielle for that reason.
Let me just break down my relationship with Cinderella, the character, as a child. I was probably about 7. My baby cousin at the time really wanted to watch the Disney Cinderella, the original film. And I was bored out of my mind watching it because I grew up with just the sequel. I don't know what it was about me with reading books out of order and watching movies out of order, but I really liked Cinderella 2. And then later down the road when Cinderella 3 came out,
Bad kitty.
I was like, I guess I love Cinderella now, because Cinderella in the 1950s version didn't really do it for me. If I went and rewatched it now, I would probably have a lot more appreciation for her character, but I was very one of those superficial,
oh, it's just her doing house chores, how boring.
I want it to be different. Oh, she talks to
part of the problem.
You think you're special? I'm not like other girls. Anyways, I remember, like, this is why it's important that it was at my cousin's house, because later, a few years later, probably when I was like 10 or 11, I went to the same cousin's house, and my aunt really loved the 1998 Ever After movie, and she put it on, and I was bored at first. I was like, oh, their costumes are really set in the 16th century, and so you can imagine some of the coloring for somebody who is used to like really bright, bold color palettes, especially in the 2000s. I was like,
warm.
Huh?
C'est quoi?
Like, what is this?
Qu'est-ce que c'est?
As time went on, though, because I remember my dad showed up to pick me up because it was just one of those like playdate things. By the time he showed up, we had just about like 15 minutes of the movie left.
I refuse to leave.
Because I was like, I need to know what happens to Danielle. So that's the power that this movie had over me as a 10-year-old. She's actually a great Cinderella because, again, she really has that depth. So for me, what exactly made the movie so iconic? It's the way that Danielle and Henry push each other to be better, which I think they kind of like touch on that in the 2015 version in the Disney live action, you know, when she's calling him out for hunting, they'd like do a little bit of that same interaction. And so we get a taste of that in the 2015 version, but here they actually actively disagree with each other quite a bit. To be fair, at the start of the movie, when she calls him out on the trafficking of it all, he actually lets one of the servants go because the servant is actually kind of like a father figure of some sort to her. But she then even calls him out later down the road in the movie. They're walking down the road and she's like, you let one man go, but did you think of the others? And I thought that always stood out to me because she actively just kept calling him out on his BS. And at the same time, he would call her out too about like being scared, like that sort of thing. I really appreciate that they were on equal ground. That's another thing I love about rom-coms. The ones that really do it really well are when like the power dynamics aren't so not balanced.
Yeah.
And I thought that the imposter trope was really fun too. It's very
I love
tasty,
an imposter trope.
Like the idea that she is posing as this comtesse when she's actually a servant girl. Thought that was like really refreshing. Yeah. And the way that the events transpire leading up to the reunion of Danielle and the glass slipper is refreshing. Because even as a 10-year-old, I was already used to, oh, well, I already know how this story goes. We, as a society, have rehashed this story across like centuries and across cultures. But I thought that the way that they integrated the fact that she was pretending to be somebody else, you don't even have a fairy godmother here. I mean, what more can you say?
Leonardo DaVinci is a freaking fairy godmother in this movie.
It's very romantic.
It is.
In the old sense of the word. It doesn't feel like a fairy tale, but it is romantic.
It is very romantic.
It's like color palette, everything like with that has a warmth to it, and it's all very good.
Yeah, they balance the sincerity with the humor so well.
Yes.
Like on one hand, Leonardo da Vinci will walk across water in his invention towards Danielle, and that part always gets me cracking up. But at the same time, he later calls Henry out when he's being a dick to Danielle, but he also encourages Danielle the way a fairy godmother would. I also said that Danielle says that she'll cut an old geezer up from navel to the top of his head, so what more could you ask for? Like, she's probably one of the more, I don't know how to phrase this, but like,
not vulgar, but like
she's got like more street smart, I think, than the other Cinderella iterations, which isn't bad because, you know, I'm probably more in line with the 2015 Cinderella than I am with Danielle.
And she's a great Cinderella too.
But I think that it's refreshing and it doesn't feel like she's not Cinderella still. You know that she's still Cinderella, which I really appreciate. There's complexity. One of my favorite things over the years has been rewatching the dynamics between the stepsisters and the stepmother especially. Like, they're so real. And especially with our girl Angelica, she brings like a nuance to the stepmother who clearly envies an intimacy that Danielle inspires with most people that she comes across. We see this in the very start of the movie where she is very close with her father, And when Angelica delivers the lines where she's like, "You can't leave me.
You cannot leave me here! You cannot leave me here!"
It just
Gets
brings that
chills every time.
desperation. Yeah, like, you get why she's so bitter. It doesn't make her bitterness right or her cruelty right, but you understand, given the historical context that they've established, why she would be upset that her husband, her newlywed husband, has passed away, leaving her with this really, I guess in her head, like an idealized little girl who manages to foster community everywhere she goes. And I feel like, again, they tried to touch on this with Cate Blanchett's version, which I also appreciated.
She's pretty complex too.
But I feel like Angelica brought something different, something more, a little bit more oomph for me. Plus because she had more screen time. So, yeah.
Yes. Well, and it's just the way that, you know, if we're comparing the two, this version has more weight in reality, whereas that version is more like a fairy tale. So
yeah.
In that same way, we have an actual cultural, contextual setting for Angelica's character to have that jealousy or have that place in society where she's really trying to maintain her status. And I think that that's very telling in this society where there's such a disconnect between the wealthy and the poor, and how she contributes to that versus the Cinderella version, the fairy tale version of the stepmother, who is obviously clamoring for wealth and status by the way that she tries to get into the royal family, but it's lacking a little bit of that cultural impact that you get in Ever After. I don't think it's necessarily better than other Cinderella stories. I just think that she's such a captivating character, and the stepsisters are too. Obviously, we have that dynamic, I think, in every iteration, pretty much, of the more conniving stepsister. The older one is a lot more
of a bitch.
She's meaner, and she's usually the one that's like worse to Cinderella, and then you have the Anastasia that is generally portrayed as not smart and portrayed as at times more capable of compassion.
Yeah.
Which doesn't erase the way that she can be mean, but I think in this movie in particular, they do something really nice with that, which is where she's more complex in the way that she does have compassion, but her status makes it difficult for her to find a way to work within that.
It's like
or she learns through the movie how to be better at it.
It's very clear that she wants to escape the conflict herself. I know throughout the movie, she tries to stand up for Danielle, but if she gets punished in any way for it, she's still upset for it. When Marguerite tries to steal something of Danielle's, and then she calls her out on it, but then later she's asked to do the same thing as Danielle or something like that. She's like, well, why do I have to do it? Danielle's like the servant girl kind of
She's very middling in that way. Like, she reminds me of the ally that won't commit. So she doesn't like to see people, the servants, go through what they go through, but she also wouldn't want to be in that same position. And so when she is asked to be, because Danielle won't be or can't be, it's like a personal affront to her, which is frustrating with her character. But I think understanding within the context of the story, not an excuse. I just think that it's really complex.
Yeah.
But in the way of the narrative, and obviously if you haven't seen it and you're listening to this, I'm so sorry for the spoilers. But in the way of the narrative, in the end, she kind of gets off a little easy in that way. I still think that for the most part, the characterization and the direction of the characterization is really good. Which reminds me that you had mentioned Henry earlier, but I didn't really get to pop in with it. He's like a really good prince character, I feel, as a love interest. He's got the Prince Charming elements, and he's also got the prince elements of a rom-com, which is that we watched Prince and Me recently, and that prince is a pretty typical example of the William/Harry example of a prince that we see in rom-coms, where he's like the playboy prince who has a softer side inside that you wouldn't have seen. And I think Henry is a play on that in a way. He's a little bit foolish and a little bit impulsive. And he's, of course, got the plot where he's, like, coming of age into his being king one day. And that's a big Cinderella thing, is that he's going to be king, so he has to get married, obviously. and how he has to approach that. And I think that they do a really good job of establishing him as this character that's quick to anger, or at least to frustration, but very passionate, or wanting to be passionate. He has this whole conversation with Danielle where he's like in awe of her because she knows what she wants. She has all these things that she loves to talk about. And he's like, I don't have that. And I wish that I had that. And I think that it's such a great exploration of his character and a great contrast to Danielle, which is why they feel so good in that fairy tale way of being a couple. But he's also like, he throws these fits as a character like him would do. And instead of getting what he wants, largely throughout the film, people will be like, you're being stupid.
Yeah.
Stop being so selfish.
Right.
Like, especially when it comes to Danielle later on, he's pretty selfish about feeling hurt by her and not understanding her point of view. And he's told repeatedly, you need to stop being selfish and understand where Danielle's coming from. And so externally, he's getting this feedback and he has to reflect on it. And I think that that's a really strong way to portray his character.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite, probably one of my top 5 favorite, like, male rom-com love interests, because he listens, because he takes that feedback, and instead of really internalizing that and being like,
well, screw all of you,
he really, like, reflects, like you said, and I really appreciate that from him. Especially, he's just really charming in a way that's not like the story isn't telling you that he's charming through the dialogue, which, by the way, the dialogue throughout the movie is consistently iconic, especially among the family. Everybody who speaks, like, it's all serving the story, and it's also very evocative of who they are as people. The scene that you talked about where he's in awe of her really has hit home for me over the years, where he's like, you know, you have more passion in a single memory than I have an entire lifetime, or whatever he says. In one line, shows so much about his character, shows so much of what he wants out of life and what he's not getting.
It almost tends to be that kind of cliche or trope where the rich person's like, oh my gosh, you have so much,
right,
you know, warmth and love,
even though you live in poverty.
Yeah. But to that point, two points there. He doesn't even know she's poor when he says that, which is flawed in its own way. But the other point there is that I think they still do it in a way that's got a lot of depth to it. It does serve the story and it does fit the character. The movie had its drawbacks, but, like, honestly, when I think of Ever After and I think of how we've watched it or engaged with it, it feels like a 10 out of 10 every time. I know that there are, like, little things to maybe pick at, like we kind of poke fun at Drew's accent a little bit because it does kind of stand out, but it's charming in its own way. Like, it's not the best, but, you know, I think it gives Danielle character.
It does. It's cute in, like, a, oh, you're trying sort of way. I really appreciate how, you know, to the point of dialogue and how in just one line they can show so much about one character. At the same time, what they give time and a lens to, like, for example, when Danielle brings home, I think his name is Maurice, the servant that she frees earlier on in the film. No words are spoken, but they start running towards each other. She and Maurice are starting to run towards the other servants in the household. And we see a glimpse of them maybe in the start of the movie when Danielle's still a child. But in that one scene, it's so short, when they're running towards each other, no words, they just start crying with joy. You know that that's her family. And I really appreciate that they gave Danielle a support system like that, because up until that point for me, I only had the mice to look at. Or, on the other hand, for a Cinderella story,
anything is
Carter.
possible if you just believe.
Which, yeah, and Rhonda too, and Rhonda, to be fair.
Yeah.
But they don't really afford as much, like, nuance to those characters. Obviously, it's a different kind of film as well, but I just thought it was really cool how immediately you know what their relationship is. Same thing with Henry's parents. In other films, I feel like they're very cookie cutter, or, like, they're not as well-rounded of characters. But the mom and the dad for Henry, they feel so...
You are the crown prince of France!
And it is my life.
Francis, sit down before you have a stroke.
Palpable, and I really appreciate that. I would say the weakest character would be the creepy old man character.
Oh, he like you don't even
gross.
want him there.
Yeah, like he's like kind of
Probably serves the
unnecessary.
story, but like.
But like, did I really need to see that? Did I really need to see him like flirting openly with Danielle?
That brings up one of the bigger themes, I think, or one of the underlying themes of the film that maybe other Cinderella stories don't touch on as much, which is the misogyny. And,
Right, yeah.
The way that Henry, for example, is even sexist towards her, or how his mother, to your point about how she has more depth to her, how she speaks up about how women are treated or what's expected of them in that society, or the princess that Henry is supposed to marry, just what she ends up going through, her grief over the relationship. I think that there's a lot going on there, and the creepy old man whose name I forgot because I literally would just rather erase him from my mind is a player in that. He's the one that explicitly makes Danielle feel gross.
Yeah.
If they removed him from the story, I think all of those things would still be expressed in a meaningful way. So if they had to get rid of him, that would be great. It is what it is. And
I changed my mind. I do think that he is realistic because he is pretty...
Yes.
I think that's why I hate him so much. Just because it's like, I know men like this and it's disgusting.
It's harder when you're older as a woman, to watch
that scene.
Scenes.
Yeah.
There's a couple.
Especially towards the end.
Yes.
But to that point, what I really appreciated, even as a child, was how Danielle triumphs over that by herself. It's one of those, like, overt, she's Cinderella, but she's taking ownership of her own story kind of thing. But at the same time, she still gets, with spoiler alert, if you weren't aware, the ending of every Cinderella story ever, she does get with Henry. But I always appreciated how he came after she had already saved herself.
Yes.
Which doesn't, like, take away from any of the other Cinderellas, because I am not going to sit here and be like, yeah, the other Cinderella should have done that too.
Tune in 2 weeks when we talk about all
when
the
we talk, yeah, exactly. The whole Cinderella cinematic universe, the CCU, if you will.
CCU.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah, no, this one is, I say it's quintessential because I feel like people have an idea of what Cinderella is supposed to be. And I think this movie in particular is one of the ones that breaks that mold, or at least gives context to it. So this wouldn't be a Cinderella story if it didn't stem from what makes Cinderella Cinderella, or what makes that story that story. And I think that it takes the things that Cinderella goes through, like her abuse, or it takes Cinderella's compassion and love, and it elevates it in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think that, for example, if you are not someone who enjoys the Disney Cinderella or doesn't enjoy fairy tale stories, I think you would still really like this one. And I think that on its own, apart from being Cinderella, it is a really strong romantic movie. Like it's, I would say, a romance drama. And the relationships that she has overall and her love interest, that relationship, are really well done. There's so many moments for their romance that really stand out to me, and for Danielle's character that really stand out to me. Like the scene in the woods when she is they get, I guess, robbed effectively, and she's told that, like, she can leave with as much as she can carry, and all she does is pick up Henry. I think that is so charming and really good energy, and I love that is something that Danielle brings to the table as a Cinderella character, compared to some other iterations where she's just not afforded that room because of the nature of the story.
Right, exactly. In any case, it's a good movie. You should rewatch it, or watch it if you haven't given it a chance, like, ever.
Watch it. It's a really
ever after
classic.
Yeah. It's classic to us for a reason, and if you watch it, then you'll know for sure. So leave a comment if you haven't watched it, or if you have, and you're like, these are all my favorite scenes. It's surprising to me, but not also surprising at the same time, how many people I've seen who are on my timeline on Twitter, like on my personal account, who really love the movie, and like I didn't know that they loved it either, because it's one of those like underrated
Yeah.
movies, I think, because
I
not a
mean-
lot of people have watched it or know about it that I've spoken with like in real life, but for some reason it stuck to, I guess, the bidding community.
Well, and
'Cause
I
they
was
know-
surprised,
have-
I was
yeah.
surprised to find out you had seen it whenever we first talked about it.
Right, yeah, it's
We were
like,
both like, what? Like,
it's like under the radar.
it feels like something that people haven't really heard of. It is kind of like a hidden classic that I think everybody
Yeah.
should watch. So definitely check it out.
Yeah. I mean, I know we watched it with Nabs last year, and she'd never watched it before, and so she ended up really loving it just by watching it for the first time in 2020. So she has great taste,
Yeah, exactly.
so highly recommend it.
Go check it out and then let us know what you think of it, because we could talk about this movie forever.
Yes.
I mean, there's just so many good. I want to go watch it right now.
Yeah, pretty much.
It is such a strong example of this story, and obviously we have a lot we want to talk about with the Cinderella stories. Tune in next
So
week
tune
for that,
in.
or tune in to
Yeah.
the next episode for that one. I would rate this one a 10 out of 10. Everything we review on here is going to be 10 out of 10.
Yeah,
I love it so much.
exactly. I'm gonna go rewatch some scenes and take on Drew Barrymore's shoddy British/not French accent.
Yeah.
All right, bye. Have a great Saturday.
I would not offend you so.
It is your manner that offends, Danielle.
You will marry Gabriella by the next full moon, or I will strike at you in any way I can.
What's it to be, Father? Hot oil or the rack?
I will simply deny you the crown and live forever.
I've grown rather fond of our intrigues together.
Oh, I do love a good intrigue. Hey,